Our technology at LanzaJet that takes ethanol and transforms it into SAF is very efficient and it's highly tailored to get to SAF. But if you think about HEFA, HEFA starts with an oil and through that process, breaks down that oil and you get different products as a result of it. For us, when you start with ethanol, it's a very clean molecule that you convert from ethanol to ethylene, which basically means you're removing water. And then that ethylene molecule, we start to take it through a process where we start to build up the carbon chains that you want for the fuels that you want to produce.
Welcome to Sustainability in the Air, the world's first podcast dedicated to sustainable aviation. I'm your host, Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simplifying. Every Thursday, I have important conversations with top aviation executives, technology entrepreneurs, and policymakers helping aviation take climate action. Conversations that help separate the signal from the noise. Whether you are a frequent flyer or an airline executive, if you care about sustainability or simply love traveling, welcome aboard. My guest today is Jimmy Samartzis. Jimmy is the CEO of LanzaJet. Many of you may have been familiar with LanzaJet, became the first company in the US to open a commercial scale alcohol to jet plant. LanzaJet, of course, is using LanzaTech's technology to make this sustainable aviation fuel and is now in talks with countries from Australia to Kazakhstan to India to build SAF facilities there. The unique thing about Jimmy is he has an aviation background. Jimmy was a vice president of customer experience at United Airlines and also led their global environmental affairs and renewable fuels strategy as their senior managing director. So he brings a lot of aviation expertise into the SAF business. Jimmy and I have a fascinating conversation today, and I hope you enjoy listening to it. Jimmy, congratulations on your first ethanol to sustainable aviation fuel production facility in Georgia. It's the world's first, I believe. What's been the journey getting here, and what have been the biggest challenges?
I appreciate it. It was a phenomenal moment, not just for us as a company, but I think for us as an industry. Some of us, including myself, have been at this for quite some time. I started doing this work in 2008, and to see a new technology go from an idea to operation is a big deal. And certainly was a big deal for us as a company because we've been at it now as LanzaJet and LanzaTech together since about 2010. So launching this and having the grand opening in January of 2024, it was a 14-year journey to go from idea to development work, pilot plant, demo plant, and then the commercial scale facility. So it was rewarding to have that celebration because it was a moment in time for us to take a step and sort of acknowledge all the hard work that's been going on at our company, but also across the industry. It was actually a really neat event for me because it did become a celebration of sort of the industry's work in developing the SAF market, really, and putting in place all the foundational pieces. So very rewarding, right, to be there for me personally, for me as the head of this company, but also for me as a person within the industry that's been working hard to build this.
The interesting thing is that I don't think a lot of people listening to this podcast are aware, but I would love for you to clarify the difference between LanzaTech and LanzaJet.
Yeah, it's something that we come across every now and then. Listen, we're part of the way to think about it is we're part of the same family in a way, right? LanzaTech focuses on taking waste carbon and making it into chemicals, including ethanol. And I think, as you know, they've been super successful with that technology, which they call gas fermentation, and using a microbe to convert carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide into things like ethanol. And then our company focuses on the fuels technology, which is taking ethanol as a starting point and making it into sustainable aviation fuel and renewable diesel. So we are, technically independent companies. LanzaTech is a part owner in our company. We oftentimes work together in the market. So sometimes we bring both solutions together. So we can go from a waste carbon molecule all the way to the finished fuel product. So we work with customers on combining the two technologies. And at the end of the day, they're a great partner to us, right? So, both in terms of, having a great technology solution that we can put together and bring to the market, but also, they were behind our LanzaJet technology from 2010 till 2020 when they spun it out so that it could kind of go at its own pace, right? So, and the idea back in 2020 was let the two technologies kind of run at their own speed and create, multi-billion-dollar value, if you will, with two separate companies, as opposed to, keeping it together and probably letting one go faster and holding back on the other just because of prioritization within a company.
Well, you're from United, so this sounds like to me how United and Mileage Plus work. Spin it off as a separate company, and one day you wake up and Mileage Plus is more valuable than United Airlines, the parent airline.
Yeah, I don't know that I would say that we're more valuable than LanzaTech. I think LanzaTech is doing a great thing out there in the industry. But I do think it's pretty neat to see, both companies succeeding in the market, both companies having and finding their place in the market, and both equally finding value in different parts of the global market, right? So it's, I think at some point in time when people look back, I think it's going to be a nice story to capture, right, and a nice story to write about.
Well, we are hoping that we can be the ones doing that starting today. Now, my understanding is that LanzaTech, of course, became very successful licensing its own technology, not just selling the end product, which was, I think, the different thing. You don't have to wait till you build the plant to sell it. Is LanzaJet then licensing the LanzaTech technology? And if so, is it exclusive? Can LanzaTech also lend its technology to LanzaJet's competitors?
Yeah. So are you asking, just to clarify, are you asking about the LanzaTech gas fermentation technology, or yes? Or are you asking about the, I'll call it the jet technology, which was the one that we have?
Both, if you can clarify for me.
Yeah. So let me clarify. Let's start with, I'll call it the jet, right? So let's talk about LanzaJet and sort of the core of the business that we're in and how we sort of interface with the market. At the core, we are a technology and engineering company, right? So we have the alcohol-to-jet technology that takes ethanol and transforms it into SAF and renewable diesel. We are currently working with customers in more than 25 countries on 5 continents, right? So if you just think about that as a snapshot of the breadth of activity, it is far and wide in terms of, impact. In most of those cases, we are licensing our technology, meaning licensing the ethanol to SAF technology. In some cases, it made more sense for us to enter into a joint venture so that we are partnering up with another company. And there's different reasons to do that in different parts of the world. And then what's unique about us is we also have now built and we own and we're gonna operate our own biorefinery, right, which is the one in Georgia, in Freedom Pines. So a bit unusual in that we, as a technology company, you end up building, owning, and operating your own plant. But super important for us as part of our strategy in, deploying the technology globally, having the expertise in how to operate this novel technology that we can share with others and train folks on. And at the end of the day, what we're also finding is we are still in the infancy of building this industry. So, getting these SAF projects off the ground oftentimes means that the project owners need some level of help. It's not just the technology that they need, but they also may need help on feedstock. They may need help on offtakes. They may need help on policy. There's a lot that still is in development, and every single day we're hearing about something new that's happening from a government policy perspective, right? At the very least. So we also show up to help our customers with more than just the technology, so we can be helpful to them on things like feedstock and offtake and policy and on developing a project. So we've built a very strong capability in what we call project development, which is meant to support our customers in developing their projects. And there are going to be some circumstances where it might make sense for us to build, own, and operate a second or a third facility, right? But that's a longer term idea for us. But right now, focusing on the core licensing business and what we call project development. So when it comes to LanzaTech and us working together, when there's a customer who wants to, for example, take that waste carbon emission from an industrial process and make it into SAF, we approach that customer with a joint solution, right? That is an integrated solution between LanzaTech and LanzaJet. And in that case, it is sort of LanzaTech licensing its technology and us licensing our technology.
So from what you're telling me, it can be quite complementary. Both of you can be going in together.
Yeah, we oftentimes do that because there are customers, for example, who want to take municipal solid waste and they want to make them to SAF. Well, we can do that, right? LanzaTech can take the municipal solid waste and convert that through its process to ethanol. And then we show up with our technology and take that ethanol and make it into SAF. It ends up being a very efficient way to do it, and different than how we've heard about it in the past, which has been through Fischer-Tropsch technology, right?
Right.
The really neat thing about this combination of technologies, when you think about something like municipal solid waste, MSW varies, right? What's in the trash 1 week or 1 day varies to the next day. And, folks that have tried this in the past with other technology solutions spend a lot of time cleaning up that trash, cleaning up that municipal solid waste to get a very specific gas stream that they then have to feed into a Fischer-Tropsch unit. What's different for us is because the LanzaTech process on the front end is a biologic process and it uses a microbe, you can feed it the MSW as it is without all of the cleanup and the sorting that has to happen otherwise. And that microbe produces a very consistent stream of ethanol, which then makes it easy for us to come in with our technology and take that ethanol and make it into SAF. So there are lots of those kinds of opportunities, whether it's a country that wants to focus on MSW, a country that might want to focus on ag residues or ag waste, or a country that has a very large industrial complex and wants to leverage, steel mill off gases, right, and convert that into ethanol and from ethanol to SAF. So the LanzaTech solution bolted on the front end of what we do gives us a ton of flexibility, right, to create SAF from any number of waste sources that might be relevant to any country. So that's what's really exciting about it. And then for us, separate of that, focusing on ethanol as a starting point, you have lots of ethanol available in today's market, right? More than 30 billion gallons of ethanol is used today for transportation. It gets blended into gasoline tanks. So the opportunity is in, various countries is how do you take that ethanol as road transport electrifies, as ethanol producers are wanting to find a new market to serve? How do you pivot from road transport to air transport? So it's a great solution that can leverage an abundance of feedstock that's available today to create SAF in large quantities, large volumes today as well.
So you mentioned your technology is different from Fischer-Tropsch, for example. How exactly does LanzaJet's technology differ from the traditional SAF production methods, Fischer-Tropsch or not? And does this offer a particular advantage to you in terms of scalability and just overall sustainability?
Yeah, so for us, our technology at LanzaJet that takes ethanol and transforms it into SAF is very efficient and it's highly tailored to get to SAF. So let's break that down a little bit, right? So, the other pathway, the one pathway that's been deployed globally is HEFA, hydroprocessed esters and fatty acids. There are a number of projects that are looking to deploy Fischer-Tropsch, but as to my knowledge, I don't think any of them are yet fully operational commercially. But if you think about HEFA, HEFA starts with an oil, and through that process, breaks down that oil, and you get different products as a result of it. For us, when you start with ethanol, it's a very clean molecule that you convert from ethanol to ethylene, which basically means you're removing water. And then that ethylene molecule, we start to take it through a process where we start to build up the carbon chains that you want for the fuels that you want to produce. So because you're taking a core molecule and building it up, you get to very selectively deliver the products that you want, as opposed to starting with an oil that you then get different cuts from, if you will, right? Somehow, that's how crude oil works as well. So, the ethanol to SAF process is quite a bit different from the other processes. It is, in some cases, much more capital light. You have an abundance of feedstock, right? You don't need to worry about where that feedstock will come from because there's lots of ethanol around. It's very much targeted towards SAF. So we can produce up to 90% of the product mix as SAF and 10% renewable diesel. There's no waste product that comes out of the system. We're able to, within a period of a day, right, transition to producing more RD and less SAF, anywhere, up to 75% RD and 25% SAF. So it's a very flexible process from that perspective. And then, from a carbon perspective, nearly all of the carbon that you start with in the ethanol ends up in the finished product. So you don't lose any of that energy in the process of transforming that ethanol molecule into the SAF molecule. So for all those reasons, right, it is a very attractive process, but also creates a very attractive product. The SAF that we produce also has a higher energy density compared to its fossil equivalent, which means you don't need as much of it, right, to go the same distance for those who think about aviation, which is also unique, right? The industry hasn't had to grapple with this quite yet, which is, you're producing a more energy dense fuel, which is helpful. How do you account for that value then when you're selling that into the market? So these are all things that we're now coming upon as we're entering the market with the first gallons from ethanol.
Wow, thank you for clarifying, and this is very enlightening, I have to say.
Sure.
You have a target of producing 1 billion gallons of SAF annually by 2030, not 2050, not 2040, 2030. What's needed to get there in terms of steps as well as partnerships that you have to pull together?
Yeah, good question. Taking a step back, I think we have been very specifically sort of architecting this company. So when I say that, I'm referring to the fact that we've had the company founded with a great set of investors, and we've been adding to that since then with some recent announcements over the last few weeks. But if you think about what we've been doing, we've been building a team, right, for lack of a better word, that fulfills every aspect of the value chain. So when you think about a company like Shell, who's one of our investors, or British Airways, right? Shell is well known in operating refineries worldwide and having a great technical acumen, right? British Airways obviously is an off-taker and very forward-leaning on its desire to decarbonize. We also brought on Mitsui, which is one of Japan's largest conglomerate companies and a company that has its hands on in many industries around the world, but also is one of the largest traders of ethanol in the world, right? We've brought on Southwest Airlines, which is a U.S. carrier that has a big ambition for 2030 in terms of decarbonization. We've brought on Microsoft, right, which has a strong interest in renewable diesel for its data centers, for example, has a strong interest in SAF certificates, which they've demonstrated in the past. We've been building a very strong team that's helping us build the industry, but also helping us to build out our own business, if you will, right, for LanzaJet. We also, I forgot to mention, we have Suncor Energy in the mix, which is Canada's largest integrated oil company. So, one thing we did as we architected this company was all of our founding investors were also going to build plants with us using our technology. So from the very beginning, we thought about how do we do this together and how do we help build the company, but how do we help build the industry and advance the industry together, which has been super helpful. So when you think about our 1 billion gallon target, that takes into account, right, the work and the knowledge that we have with what we're doing with each of our investors. It takes into account the knowledge we have around how to access feedstock and create the right capacity. And as I mentioned earlier, we have activity in more than 25 countries. And here within the United States, we have several projects, many of which are not public. But that 1 billion gallon aspiration is actually within reach for us. So we are feeling confident that we have been developing all the right foundations, if you will, for getting to that billion gallon target by 2030. And I think energizes all of us here at LanzaJet, right? It's something that we talk about often in terms of the aspiration, but also the action that we're taking to actually deliver on that. I'll share this with you, and I think it's important. It's important for us at LanzaJet, and hopefully others find value in it too. But we have a motto here, or a slogan that says "Someday is now." And that honestly, if you think about it, usually takes people a couple of minutes to say, to kind of take a step back and think about what that really means. For us, it means you don't have to wait to tackle climate change someday, right? You can do that today. You don't have to wait to decarbonize aviation as a sector. You don't have to wait to have technology that's ready to go. All of these things with our company are available today, right? So someday is now is the sense of urgency that we have around tackling the issue. All the work that we've done to put in place the building blocks to be able to do so. And 2030, even though it's 6 years away, is a long time away, but it's not, right? In this business, it takes multiple years, right, to build these plants. But we are well on our way. We're excited about getting to 2030 and to taking all the, and undertaking all the action that's required to get there.
That's fantastic. And I'm quite excited hearing about this. The last time we met, I remember we spoke about you being in talks with Kazakhstan, Australia. I mean, and you're talking about plants in the US. Of course, I'm guessing all of these adding up together will make for that 1 billion. But tell me, why countries as disparate and far as Kazakhstan and Australia, why would these countries be so interested in working with LanzaJet?
Yeah, so let's take that into two parts. I think one is what's the motivation in some of these countries to build out their own SAF industry, right? I think I oftentimes think about this and talk about it this way too, right? There's different reasons to be motivated and to have a sense of urgency. Climate is certainly top of the list in terms of, is a country motivated to do its part to address the climate change issue? In other cases, there might be a desire around energy security. Some of these countries import all their crude oil or import all their jet fuel, and they rely on others, right, for that product. Do they have an opportunity to do that within their own country? When you think about renewable fuels, it usually requires a feedstock that can be and is domestic to most countries. So how do they think about leveraging it as an energy security issue for them domestically? How do they think about it as an economic development opportunity for them domestically as well? So when you think about Australia, just to use that as an example, Australia today produces quite a bit of sugar, but that sugar gets exported out of the country. And most of it goes to the north, goes to Southeast Asia and other Asian countries. Australia has some ethanol production, but what if you were actually to retain the sugars within Australia? What if you were to actually get the ethanol production going within Australia? Australia is also concerned about its energy supply and national security concerns for its own military based on supply chain disruption that may happen in the Asian area, right, in the Asian geography. So when you think about Australia, it's certainly a climate issue for them because they care about the climate uniquely. They also want their Olympics that they're hosting to be a green Olympics. It's an economic development opportunity for them across their country to support the agricultural sector and the industrial sector. It's an energy security issue for them, and it's a national security issue for them, right? So that's a country that has different reasons why they care to do it. If you think about the United States, right, the United States has a phenomenal ag industry and an existing biofuels industry. The biofuels industry in the US today is ethanol, right? And the ag industry is the source for that ethanol, right? There's a lot of corn that gets produced that's used for that ethanol.
By ag, you mean agriculture?
Agriculture, correct? Yeah. So when you think about the U.S. and the farming community, the agricultural community, they're looking at they're today serving a market which is ethanol, and that ethanol serves a market which is road transportation. All of a sudden, they now have concerns about road transport is electrifying. Certain states in the U.S. are mandating vehicles transition to electric vehicles. So they're questioning what is their livelihood, what's their vitality over the long term. So here we are presenting a new technology and building a new market that gives that agricultural sector, that ethanol and the existing biofuels industry, a ray of hope, right? That there's a new market that they can now serve, which is aviation. So, I love what we do, which is awesome technology. It's innovative technology. But when you take a step back, it makes me super proud to think of the impact that we're having, right? It's not just about the technology and creating those molecules. It is about, what is the impact we're having with the farming and the agricultural community? What is it with these rural communities that, haven't had much hope in terms of building out an economy? And the impact you're having on helping countries secure themselves, right? And their future and their growth. We're doing work in India with India's largest oil company. That for us is a joint venture with the Indian Oil Corporation. You think about India. India today is the most populous country in the world, and significant growth ahead for them, right? The middle classes and lower classes are just now beginning to travel via air. So how do you enable that to happen sustainably? And from the prime minister on down within India, a strong focus on growth of the country, but also equally on doing so sustainably. So, they are all in on, innovative technologies that can help them do that. So it's a fascinating business to be in, right? It's awesome to be building a company, but also incredible to think about, the impact we're having in countries, and that's different, right? Different impact in different countries, which is incredible to think about sometimes.
This is a very unique positioning, and I think the timing is quite good. The momentum you're having is quite phenomenal. Yes, absolutely. Countries want energy security, especially in the aftermath of what's happened in the last 3-4 years politically, globally. Everyone wants their own energy security. And I can see if there's growth in countries like India coming, then they want their own, or Australia for that matter, they want their own energy sources. One question I have is around feedstocks. When you go from country to country, continent to continent, they change. In the US, corn is abundantly available. And as you said, trucking changes to electric, more of this ethanol can be used for aviation. But HEFA, as a pathway, is not going to be approved in the EU for future SAF production as a pathway. Yet there are countries like the Philippines, which is looking at coconut to SAF, or Malaysia, which is clamoring for palm oil to SAF, which I'm still trying to figure out how it will be sustainable. But are you open to all of these pathways? Which pathway do you think will form a large majority of this billion gallons of SAF that you will be producing in 2030?
Yeah, so for us, it's all about the alcohol to jet pathway, right? That is what we do as a company, is ethanol to SAF. It's the technology we own that we've developed over more than a decade. That is what we're focusing on. And I think for me, when you look at independent firms that have done studies around these different technology pathways and what they've perceived to be the growth, I think by and large, all of them are pointing to alcohol to jet as being that next generation technology that is now ready to scale, right? And that is I think, accurate even from where we sit as a company that has that technology, right? We see that opportunity on a global basis. But let's not forget it's important, to have feedstocks and to have SAF that also meets, certain criteria, that is sustainably certified. All those things are, super important to us. The plant that we have here in the United States, it is going to, it's an ISCC certified process and plant and product right across the value chain. That's an important certification, I think, for us and for anyone, right? Whether it's ISCC or RSB potentially. But those types of certifications are important across the value chain to ensure that ultimately the product achieves the life cycle impact that you expect and that you tout it achieving, and that it was done so sustainably. You have, different incentive mechanisms throughout the world, right? In the United States, the way the policy is structured, it's based on performance, right? Can you achieve a minimum reduction of 50% in carbon intensity? Then you can qualify, right, for the incentive. The better you do, meaning the better the reduction in carbon intensity, the more incentive you get, right? So it's agnostic as to the technology, but it is centered on, can you achieve the environmental benefits that are needed? Different, right? You mentioned Europe before the EU. Europe has chosen to identify feedstocks that they think are appropriate and feedstocks that are not appropriate. What's a bit unfair in Europe is that they treat road transport differently than they treat air transport. So in Europe, for example, corn is allowed for road transport for renewable diesel, yet it's not allowed for aviation. Although you might be able to achieve a significant reduction and have it be sustainably certified, it still doesn't qualify, right? So you can't use it there. Should that change? It should change, right? It should be an even playing field for aviation to be able to develop appropriately. And I think, one of the things that we're seeing, at least, is you're not seeing or witnessing the investment go into markets that are constrained from that perspective in terms of policy. The UK just came out with its update about a week ago. All of a sudden, you're seeing a ton of excitement on the UK again, right? Which is what policy does when you're building an industry, right? It generates the excitement, which translates to investment in that country and therefore infrastructure development at the end of the day. So, I think there will be a moment in time when folks look back and find some learnings in all of this, right? And I think some have learned along the way and have made adjustments. And these are governments that I'm talking about, right? That have made adjustments as they've updated policies and whatnot.
I also have a question around exclusion. How do you focus only on alcohol to jet rather than thinking about, methanol to jet looks or sounds exciting, or look at PTL or carbon capture to SAF? What about all of these other things that, in our conversation seem like distraction? Why are you focused on alcohol to jet and not the others?
So again, for us, I think alcohol to jet is the core of what we do, right? It is our technology, which is why it's a big focus for us. What I would say, though, is that, I was involved with the very first HEFA plant that was built anywhere in the world, right? Which was the one in Paramount, California. I was also involved in one of the first Fischer-Tropsch investments. And, frankly, I enabled and I didn't fly the plane, but when I was in my, predecessor company, we flew a plane with, SAF that was made using Fischer-Tropsch technology as well. So I've seen the three pathways that I think are near-term most viable. A to J has benefits against each one of those pathways, right? And which is why we continue to advocate for it, and why we continue to see a strong pull across the global marketplace for it. I think taking this back to our discussion that we were having with LanzaTech, when you think about the feedstocks that are used in some of these other processes, right, we can use the same ones. So when you think about PTL, we can use the same source to create ethanol And from ethanol, we can get to SAF. When you think about Fischer-Tropsch, which is taking a gas stream or taking MSW, we can use the same feedstocks and get to ethanol, and from ethanol to SAF, right? So when you think about the fact that we can take any one of those feedstocks and get to SAF via ethanol, the only exception being the oils that you use in HEFA, right? We can't use those. But any other feedstock, including, we can take, CO2 plus hydrogen and renewable power and create ethanol, and from ethanol to SAF. It's a very efficient pathway to take almost and nearly any feedstock and get to SAF. We tend to put names on these things, right? We tend to call them PTL, we tend to call it FT, we tend to call it these things because it uses certain technologies. But using our ethanol-based technology, we can take any one of those same feedstocks and convert it to ethanol, and from ethanol to SAF. And that is the power of sort of the joint LanzaTech and LanzaJet solution of combining those two technologies. So, again, some of these studies have, talked about the growth of the different pathways. There's one that stands out, which is a study done by LEK Consulting, which shows, significant growth in A to J in the near term, midterm, and long term, right? It has the most opportunity over the course of the next 25 years.
So you are focusing on the, biggest chunk of the pie. One of the interesting things that stood out to me about your customers is a lot of your customers are also investors. Southwest, British Airways, a lot of these. Are you able to share how these deals work?
No.
Because there's definitely not exclusivity in this. For example, British Airways also has deals with Nova Pangea, 12, of course, different types of technologies, but they've invested in LanzaJet, but not necessarily invested in everyone else. They're getting their SAF from everyone else. If you compare this to the traditional jet fuel operator, we don't see airlines investing in World Fuel Services or Air BP or even producers like Shell. Yes, I remember Delta owning a refinery, but that was an exception. Here, we are seeing airlines almost diversifying their business by securing these supplies. You were with an airline before. How does this work? Take us inside the head of an airline, head of sustainability, thinking about this.
It's interesting. I would say you have a set of airlines that have been very forward leaning, right? In terms of realizing that they have a role to play to help get this industry off the ground and to help get these technologies off the ground. Just to share our story a little bit, with LanzaJet and our alcohol to jet solution, right? Taking ethanol, transforming it into SAF. It is the first time it's ever been done in the world. Right, our plant in Georgia is the first plant ever in the world to take ethanol and transform it into SAF. Inherently, those moments carry risk with them, right? And you can't turn to traditional financial markets to support first-of-a-kind technologies or first-of-a-kind plants. So having an opportunity to pull in airlines who are willing to do a bit, right, to help and be supportive, has been super helpful to us, right? And a partner like British Airways for us, who has, a long-term offtake agreement for our plant out of Georgia, is very helpful. And those early movers benefit, right, for taking on some of that risk. The exchange is they get access to a certain volume of gallons longer term, right? Or they might get access to gallons at a beneficial price, right? It could be any of those mechanisms. These investments that these airlines have made have been super important to us, and essentially buy them, access to future fuel and help them ensure that there's positive momentum in building out these plants or these technologies. Southwest for us is a great one, right? They came on recently as an investor in our company with a substantial investment. Southwest has also acquired a company called Sapphire Renewables that has a corn stover to ethanol technology. So when you think about it strategically for us, Southwest is an important partner, not just as an off-taker, but also when you think about the value chain of how do we take a waste stream in the corn agricultural industry, right, if you will, and create value from that? How do we take that waste and make it into ethanol, and from ethanol make it into SAF? So those are the opportunities where there's some overlap, if you will, with some airlines who are more forward-leaning. You mentioned British Airways and Nova Pangea. Good example of that's a partnership between the three of us, right? So Nova Pangea takes woody waste and makes ethanol, and then we take their ethanol and make it into SAF. So, that is an important partnership for us, that, sort of buttresses up, if you will, the front end, which gives us access to the waste ethanol that's required in the UK, and that we take that and make it into SAF and sell it to British Airways. So that's how, that kind of a relationship works. And British Airways has invested in both companies, right? They're an investor in Nova Pangea and in LanzaJet because they see the value in bringing those technologies together and bringing that value chain together to do what they need ultimately, which is to produce a SAF from a waste stream in the UK.
Right. I love how you have been open to partnerships in all ways and forms, not just investors, but investor customers, potential collaborators, multiple investors and investees. Let's talk about the pushback we get about SAF sometimes. Some critics argue that, yes, the life cycle emissions of SAF are lower than traditional jet fuel, but it's still being burned and you're still releasing the same CO2 and other gases that are coming out. Maybe non-CO2 effects are reduced, still to be studied. But how do you respond to these concerns? What role do you see SAF playing in aviation's long-term decarbonization goals, where there can be options like hydrogen or electric, which become viable in the future?
Yeah, I think the airline industry or the aviation sector as a whole has come together and said SAF is the solution, right? If you think about what aviation can do, there can be, improvements to existing aircraft, if you will, right? That sort of creates a modest benefit. There are new type of propulsion technologies in aircraft that the likes of Boeing and Airbus are working on. They themselves have said, hydrogen-powered aircraft likely not a reality until late 2040, 2050, and that SAF is the solution in the near term, midterm, and longer term. Aviation is a hard sector to decarbonize, right? We often talk about that because you have infrastructure that's already in existence around the world, meaning airports and fueling infrastructures that exist. And you have these assets that are going to be around for a long time, right? These planes last for a long time when they're in the system. So how do you support this ecosystem, if you will, without having to make any further changes or investments? And SAF allows you to do that, right? SAF and our SAF at LanzaJet is a drop-in SAF. You don't need to make any changes to infrastructure, to aircraft engines, or to the value chain, right? It all works as it is. Now, you're right. All of this has to be accounted for on a life cycle basis, and all of these fuels should have sustainable certifications attached to them, right? Those things are going to be and are super important. Our fuel, for example, we have done extensive testing on it. There's a complete elimination of sulphur from our fuel, right? So when you talk about local air quality, it makes a big difference. We've done a number of tests, and you have a significant reduction in particulates. And there's a strong correlation of particulates and the development or formation of contrails, right? So there's a lot that's being studied right now. What's the impact of contrail formation on climate change? We have seen some evidence of the negative impact of contrails on climate change. So when you have a product that produces fewer contrails, that's a positive as well, right? So lower particulates is a positive in general, but particulates that then result in lower contrail formation is a benefit. And then the feedstock matters, right? In order to get the right life cycle results, the feedstock does make a difference. So having a feedstock that has a low carbon intensity to start with, or has a negative carbon intensity, that is possible, is super helpful, right? Because ultimately you're creating a reduction relative to the fossil equivalent. So, SAF products are not all created equal. There's a wide range in what SAF does in terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction or overall life cycle improvement, which is why, again, here in the United States, the country has said it has to achieve a minimum 50% reduction on a life cycle basis, right? So, that's the threshold here. And I think other countries have their own
Right.
thresholds,
It differs.
and some are figuring it out. So, there are some technologies that don't get there, that can't create that minimum reduction that's required,
Right.
which is another factor in sort of what ultimately is going to end up winning in the market.
Yep. Now, still thinking long term. Thank you for that. What about prices? Currently, SAF is anywhere from 2x to 7x jet fuel price, based on where you buy it in the world. Do you see this coming at par or even becoming cheaper than jet fuel? And if so, when?
Yeah, we see it with our own technology, right? Our LanzaJet alcohol-to-jet technology in today's world is not that much more expensive than fossil fuel, right? So when you think about that spectrum of 2x to 7x, we're on the low end of that spectrum, right? Of cost compared to fossil fuel. When we look at the plants that we're now engineering that are larger scale, larger capacity units, we see a significant improvement in the cost profile of that SAF that we produce. So, keep in mind our plant in Georgia is a small plant. It's a small commercial plant, very intentionally developed at that scale as we are commercializing. But we're also designing plants that are significantly larger than that, right? 30x the size of that plant. And the economics on a large capacity unit like that become quite favorable. Now, I think it's a different question of, would you ever sell this product at below fossil pricing, even though you can produce it below fossil price, right? That's a different discussion to have one day, right? In terms of, how do you price these things and how do you account for the carbon improvement? How do you account for the higher energy density? How do you account for these things that actually make it a more valuable product? So how do you price that in the market? And, today's market, SAF is not yet a commodity, right? There's different pricing for SAF in different parts of the world. We'll get there, right? It will become a commodity as you get production going. But the question I think remains in terms of, how do you appropriately price the SAF for the value that it creates as a product in the market?
I have to get back into your background a little bit. Some of the listeners may know your history with United Airlines. You spent a lot of time there, not just looking after sustainability, but also customer experience. Now, I'm very curious about two things. One, do you foresee, things like selling SAF in the booking path becoming mainstream? And what are some of the insights you bring from your time at United? And I believe some of your team as well is from United, including Meg. What are some of the insights that the team is bringing from being at an active airline that are being applied to your work here?
Airlines are incredible companies, I think, in general, and aviation as a sector is an incredible sector, and I think you can appreciate that, right? You are an aviation enthusiast, and you get it. It's an uber competitive market, right, for airlines, right? Multiple airlines can be serving the same destinations, right? So multiple airlines going from point A to point B. Hyper competitive in terms of selling that seat. It is difficult, I think, for an airline to say, we're going to buy the SAF, we're going to charge you more for that same ticket to take you from point A to point B. And I think that's a bit of a U.S. issue, frankly, a little bit. I oftentimes talk about climate change and talk about, is there urgency around climate change and tackling it? And I think in certain parts of the world, there is urgency because people are seeing the difference, they're feeling the difference, their livelihood is impacted directly. Communities have had to transition and move because of impacts of climate. There are some countries where, you're not necessarily seeing the impact. I live in Chicago. We had a very mild winter. We barely had any snow. We had 70 degree weather days when it should have been 25 degrees. So, we take that for granted and said, oh, we had a mild winter and it was a great warm winter and we were out and about instead of being locked in our homes. But at the end of the day, that implication is coming from the changes that are happening across our climate ecosystem, right? And are we seeing it with urgency that we need to do something about it, or are we sort of relishing in the fact that, hey, we've had some warm weather and we're going to take advantage of it? So I think that's where the consumer mindset needs to shift, where they need to see that it is a problem that needs to be resolved, and they have a role to play in that. I think in parts of Europe, you are seeing that, right? There are some European countries who've said, we're going to limit the amount of flying and you're going to take the train more, right? We've seen some airlines who've introduced green fares and, who have a decent uptick on those fares. Probably about 12 years ago, I tried to introduce, in the booking path, an opportunity for folks to offset their flight. Looking back on it, it was probably the wrong time, right? The mindset from a consumer perspective wasn't yet tuning into it in a way that would cause the right uptake on that in the booking path. Doing that today, I've seen the data from some airlines and people talk about it. You have a different uptake. Is it enough, right? I guess ultimately. The one thing that I would say is super encouraging is you have the big companies, the corporates who are traveling on these airlines, who are stepping in, right? They have their own ambitions by 2030, 2035, and they're coming in and saying, we'll buy the environmental attributes that come along with the SAF, which helps because it offsets the premium attached to the SAF. It gives the corporate that's flying on that airline the reduction in Scope 3 emissions. And it's a win-win across the board, right? So how do we do more of that in the near term to get the SAF industry moving in the right direction? Otherwise, I think airlines legitimately are in a bit of a tough spot, right? Which is, how do you, even if you have the energy to do it as an airline, how do you step forward to do it, introduce additional costs to your already burdened, mile, if you will, or seat, and still be competitive? And do consumers value that enough to say, oh no, I want to fly on that more sustainable airline instead of the other one? And I think that's where it still is shifting, right? I don't think we're there yet where consumers are willing to make the choice. The sad part about it for me is like the cost difference that you're talking about is pretty small, right? Some people talk about it as a cup of coffee, right? It's not significant for some of these routes, so there is, I would hope that your average person understands broadly sort of what's happening across our global society as it relates to climate and finds it, interesting enough, if not urgent enough, right, to do their piece about it, even if it's a cup of coffee worth of cost, right, at a minimum. So I think there's a ways to go in terms of the consumer mindset. But again, grateful that corporates are stepping in, which is incredibly helpful right now. And the industry will continue to evolve. In some cases, it will be mandated to change, which we're seeing in some countries. And in other countries, it's going to be on a voluntary basis.
Absolutely. I think the space is evolving very rapidly. A lot of it has to do with policy. And my final question is about policy. Even before United, you were once a White House intern with none other than President Bill Clinton. Now, of course, policies have changed. Governments have changed. Currently, you are having very nice tailwinds, especially in the US with all the IRA and incentives. What if the administration changes, not just in the US, but even in Australia? All of this tailwinds are coming just because the administration changed. What if in 4 years or 5 years, governments change in different countries where you're betting big on? What then? How do you de-risk that?
Yeah, I think it's for us, and especially with the specifics of the technology that we have and the fact that we use ethanol as well, it becomes, as we say here in the US, it's both a red state and blue state issue. Abroad, it's both a progressive and conservative issue, right? It sort of cuts across the political spectrum because in some cases you're dealing with how do you support rural economic development? How do you support industry? It's not just about tackling climate, right? It's about how do you support all these other issues that are important to the other side of the aisle. As we talked about before, in some cases it might be about national security, which is typically aligns with your more conservative parties. So you have that spectrum, and this is what I like about what we're trying to do. It's not just an issue that is moving forward today because of the administrations that are in place. I do feel strongly that I think even if there is a change in administrations in the U.S., in Australia, in the U.K., in wherever, pick your country, that there's enough reason to stay with it that you're going to find it sticks. And I think you're seeing the benefits already. I'll just use a very small example, which is our little plant in Georgia, right? We built this in a rural part of Georgia in a town called Soperton that had really not much going on. We used it as an opportunity to take local talent and upskill them so they have a livelihood that they otherwise would not have. And we've brought the town back to life. In fact, I was just there yesterday, and for lunch I went to one of 3 restaurants that are in the community. It was a place called it was a barbecue place.
Boneyard Barbecue.
Boneyard. Yeah, exactly.
I know
right.
Georgia well.
Thank you for knowing. I was going to mention it, but I'm like, your international readers or listeners may not care about Boneyard
Barbecue.
Yeah, so Boneyard, I talked to the owner yesterday when I was there, and she said that this has been the best year she's ever had, and they've been there forever, right? With all the construction workers and the operators that we have that kind of flow through there, it's been a huge uptick for them, right? So you start to see those impacts. It's not just the restaurant and the food, but we end up hiring a bunch of trucks for all the logistics of moving feedstock in and product out, right? You start to create an ecosystem of impact, if you will, that is really important to do. And that part of Georgia tends to be more red than it is blue. So that's just a small example of how we're seeing it live in terms of the impact it has across, if you will, the political spectrum. And you can replicate that, I think, across communities and countries throughout the world.
Fantastic. Jimmy, this has been a great conversation. There's a final part of this interview, which is called the rapid fire round, in which we get to know you a bit more personally. I'll start with a simple question. What's your favorite airline that is not United? Because you're in Chicago and used to work with United.
That's hard for me to say, right? There's different things that I like about different airlines. And even when I led customer service or customer experience at United, there were airlines that were doing a great job in customer experience that we oftentimes look to.
Let's talk about that. When you were heading up customer experience at United, what was the most referenced airline?
Listen, we oftentimes looked at airlines like Delta, right, which has had in the U.S. market, a really good reputation around customer experience. And interestingly, we oftentimes looked at it as, is that able to generate a higher value, right, on that price or on that ticket, and are they making decisions that are irrespective of sort of what is the competitive landscape doing and what is the right thing to do for the customer. Listen, I think we can talk about customer experience on a different podcast if you want, right? But I think airlines. I tend to be a big believer that customer experience matters, right? It matters not just the hard product, but the soft product, the actual, interpersonal experience that airlines deliver to their customers matters. And I think that is where you create some stickiness, right, between the customer and the airline. And that gives you the right then to maybe charge a bit more for your ticket than your competitor does. So anyhow, going back to your question though, obviously as being a former United guy and being in Chicago, I really like United. I love my investors, Southwest and British Airways as well.
Being very, very politically correct here. What's your favorite airport?
Favorite airport? Oh, that's a good one. I don't know that I have a favorite airport. I'll tell you what I do enjoy though, right? Whenever I fly, I always end up in a window seat because I love to look out the window and I love to sort of get that view. And I always take pictures. And I pass it on to my kids, right? To sort of look out the window and take pictures of the earth below, because you see some incredible things, right? From a vantage point that I think is important to have. We've carried that forward actually to LanzaJet. We have a wall that has fake airplane windows, and it has pictures that our employees have taken from an airplane window.
Love it.
Right, just as a reminder of what we're doing at this company is protecting the earth below.
Fantastic.
So it's pretty cool to kind of bring it full circle from that point of view.
I love it. I would love to come check out that wall sometime. What's your favorite book?
I do a lot of policy and technical reading. So when I pick up a book, it's oftentimes just to lose myself in a story, right? So I love and have loved Dan Brown as an author and the books that he's sort of written, whether it's the Da Vinci Code or Angels and Demons or Origin or whatever it might be.
Absolutely.
For me, it's also a little bit of, it sends me on a hunt, right? There's some tidbits that he has in there which are real. And when I go visit some of these cities, I'm actually looking at, the floor of whatever church you might have referenced to see.
The Louvre. I actually went and looked. Is there something under the Louvre?
Yeah. So I love that for that reason, right? I sort of get lost in it. I love the stories a bit. There's a bit of history. There's a bit of, sends me on a wild hunt sometimes, but I enjoy that.
Your favorite city to holiday in?
To holiday in, I love going back to Greece, right? So as a country, it's where my parents are from. I was born in the U.S., but my parents are from Greece, and it's just a beautiful country. It's a wonderful culture. So I try to go back as much as I can and try to introduce my kids to it as well.
Very nice.
Which I think is important for them to know where they came from, but it's a wonderful time. For anyone who hasn't been to Greece, I would highly encourage.
Well, this podcast is all about translating what's Greek into English. So hope that helps. The interesting thing is, when you go to Greece, they don't say, "Are you speaking Greek?" because they speak Greek. Instead, they say, "Are you speaking Mandarin or Chinese?" When in Greece. What's your favorite movie, Jimmy?
Favorite movie? I'm an odd one when it comes to these things, right? So again, similarly, if I'm sitting down to watch a movie, if I go to a movie theater with my wife and she'll tell you, I tend to fall asleep because I'm probably exhausted from just all the work. But if I'm at home or wherever, right, and I'm watching a movie, I tend to want to have it be something that is doesn't take much brain power, right? So that being said, one of my movies more recently that I do enjoy is Interstellar.
That took a lot of brain power, on the other hand.
It takes a lot of brain power, but there's a side of me which enjoys sort of trying to figure out, why are we here? How did we get here? What else is out there? You may know this, but I'm on the board of Fermilab, which is a U.S. National Department of Energy lab. And part of what Fermilab does is a lot of particle physics and trying to figure out why the universe is what the universe is, right? So there is a part of me that just genuinely cares about astrophysics, and Interstellar is one of those movies. But there's another side of me which enjoys, for example, and people are going to laugh when they hear this, but I love Pitch Perfect. It makes me laugh, and I think it's just a fun movie and a fun series of 3 movies
I would never have expected that to come from you.
And I'm okay to acknowledge that. And I'll tell you, I also love my movies from like the 80s and 90s, right? So, going back to like a Goonies kind of thing is fun for me.
Okay. What do you do in your free time, Jimmy?
I spend it with my kids. I've got, teenage kids, and if there's free time, we spend it together.
Fantastic.
I love it.
Do you do any activity together, or are you just hanging out?
Yeah, different, right? So my son is super athletic and is a varsity basketball player. So he and I oftentimes play basketball together. My daughter is the opposite. So she doesn't like that. She likes to go and hang out at the mall and go shopping.
And you accompany her?
But we oftentimes, and I accompany her, and we often, if not always, try to eat meals together, right? Mm-hmm. So spending time with them and catching up on our days is important.
Fantastic. What is something you would like to learn?
To learn, lots to learn. One thing I've wanted to do, though, is learn how to play the cello. So it's I know how to play the piano. I've played throughout my entire life, and the cello is an instrument that I want to at some point pick up and learn.
Wow. Okay. Good luck with that. Do you play any musical instrument currently?
Just the piano. The first time I made any bit of money, when I had my first bonus check, I actually went out and I bought a grand piano with
Fantastic.
it. So that was 25 years ago, and that just tells you a bit of how I'm wired, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear. I'm glad to know that. Final question: what is the best advice you have ever received?
And I think my team would probably acknowledge this too, but that no doesn't have to be the final answer, right? So I'm one that doesn't take no for an answer generally, and if people say no, I'm like, there has to be another way. And I think that's been a big part of our journey at LanzaJet, just to bring it full circle, right? There have been a lot of no's along the way, and we've had to overcome those no's and those obstacles every single time in order to be successful as a company, but also as an industry, right? And I think that's something that I hope people do take away, which is we have to find a way, right? We need to find a way, and that no does not have to be the final answer.
Fantastic. On that note, Jimmy, thank you very much for your time. Truly enjoyed this conversation, and I love the progress LanzaJet has been making, and I do wish you all the best. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me on, and good to see you again.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Sustainability in the Air. Aviation is one of the hardest to decarbonize industries, yet there are multiple paths to get to net zero. Awareness is key to a green future. So please give us your support to help our sustainable aviation insights reach a wider audience. You can do this by sharing this episode on your network, on LinkedIn, Twitter, or even WhatsApp. Or perhaps you might consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to this episode. You can start a conversation with us by writing to us at podcast@simpliflying, that's simply with an i.com. And for more content on sustainable aviation, please visit our website green.simpliflying.com and join the movement. Sustainability in the Air is an original podcast by Simpliflying. The show is produced by Juraj Toth in Slovakia. Dirk Singer is our Director of Sustainability, who leads research for each interviewee out of Greenwich, UK. Shubhadeep Pal is our supervising editor based out of Mumbai and Singapore. The articles are written by Ayushi Badola in Dehradun in India and Mira Hull in Montreal, Quebec. Creative design is led by Ligia Esteve in Montreal. Baiba Drimen is the project director for the show based out of Valencia, Spain. Special thanks to Wendy Sim in Singapore. And I'm Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simpliflying and your host. Please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn.